Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Tom Woods Show. This is episode 2496 with our old friend Naomi Brockwell. She is the creator of NBTV, which is a research and media organization focused on digital rights. You remember in the old days, one of those times we hosted the Contra Cruise, Bob Murphy and I. You came on board and we just had an absolutely tremendous time, and you sang and you were so wonderful and entertaining, and everybody loved you. So I'm glad to have you back on the show.
Oh, that's such a wonderful introduction. Naomi, remember that time when you were delightful and everyone loved you?
Everyone, honest to goodness, yeah. So anyway.
No, that was so much fun. I have wonderful memories of that cruise. Just a delightful group of people, delightful hosts. Just tremendous.
Yeah, it is. It is one of those great memories. And of course, those cruises were ruined by COVID, of course, because then the cruise industry was, obviously devastated, and then they came back requiring the shots and whatever. Yeah. But now they are more or less, knock on wood, back to normal. So
that's exciting.
Next year, I am actually launching my own. Bob's a little busy, but I'm launching my own cruise. So we're getting back to normal. The world is healing, Naomi. The world is healing.
In some ways, I think we need to be more vigilant than ever, because I think our rights are being, rug pulled from underneath us as we speak. But
right, so
I like your optimism.
Well, our rights are, but that's why Woods needs to be back out on the water with some good guests and educating people, but also refreshing us, because my gosh, day after day of enduring this, there's only so much a person can take. So, all misery and no play, makes Jack mentally ill. So we got to get out there and do some fun things. So I want to talk about a video that you published not too long ago, and an accompanying article on the subject of financial privacy. Now, this is a very interesting topic. I didn't know the actual names of the pieces of legislation involved. I suppose I knew the Patriot Act, but otherwise, I didn't know the history of this, how we went from, let's say, opening a bank account in 1968 to today. And I was just making the comparison between getting on an airplane in 1968 compared to today. And you gave the example of your medical privacy in 1968 compared to today. The analogies all throughout American life are quite striking. But as I say, today we want to talk about financial privacy in particular. Now, by financial privacy, what do we mean? And by the way, most people, as you've indicated, seem to think they have financial privacy now. After all, they have to type in a PIN to get into their account, and they have passwords and this, that, and the other thing. What is financial privacy? What ought it to be, let's say?
What ought it to be? I think that it ought to be the ability for people to be able to make transactions with other people using their own money without having to disclose that to thousands of third parties, which is the current norm. Right now, we have entered into this realm of pervasive surveillance in every corner of our financial lives, whether it's from swiping our card in an in-person sale, and that point of sale transmitter sends that data off, taking money out of our bank account, and our banks are filing all kinds of reports about everything that we do. This surveillance has become a normalized part of our everyday existence. And I took a moment to create this mini documentary about how we became okay with this, because I personally use cash as often as I can. And I've been on your show before talking about cryptocurrency. I know a lot of people don't like it, but cryptocurrency is currently the only way that you can make private digital transactions, because the payment rails of all digital transactions in the traditional financial world are completely surveilled. So if you do want any semblance of privacy, you do have to go outside of those existing financial rails. And so it's just this really crazy situation where people have normalized this surveillance in their lives. They're okay with it. They swipe cards everywhere they go. They type in payment details. All that data is collected and is sold to countless third parties, and the government gets all of it. And I'm not okay with that. And so I made this piece basically because our financial activities are incredibly personal. They reveal a huge amount about us. They show which political causes we like. They show our likes and our dislikes and our social graft and our habits and our daily movements. And they show really personal details about our sexual proclivity, our whatever you want. Our financial data, our transactions reveal all of this about us. And it gets to a stage where you think, why does the government get to collect all this? Because I was under the impression that the Fourth Amendment was meant to curtail the searches and interventions into our daily lives, into our affairs. That didn't translate to the digital world. And so I did a piece basically exploring why we have this illusion of privacy now and why our rights have kind of disappeared in this digital era. And I focus mainly on financial privacy because there's a very clear trajectory and a very clear explanation of how those rights were taken away.
Isn't it something, by the way, that so often we very, very rightly complain about fiat money, but yet the situation is so outrageous today that fiat money is like the best thing we've got, in the sense that at least the physical cash version of it, version of it, because it's untrackable.
Cash is so important, and the government's making it more and more difficult to use it.
Right.
But
so
really,
well, in tandem with this issue of financial privacy is this, even though I don't think it's mentioned in your documentary, but is this war on cash that's going on. I mean, there are some countries in Europe you can barely use cash anywhere. It's just gone. And they're not doing that for convenience. Anything they introduce for convenience is always for some sinister reason.
Yeah, you look at all the talk about CBDCs right now, and it's for convenience. It's like convenience, and it just happens to put the government in the center of every financial transaction you make. It's convenient for someone. I don't think it's for the individual.
Well, in your documentary, and again, of course, I'll link to it in the description, but in there, you cite the year 1970 as really a watershed moment in the history of financial privacy versus financial surveillance. So what happens specifically in 1970?
The Bank Secrecy Act, which I believe was really one of those pivotal moments in legislative history that fundamentally changed our relationship that we have with our financial institution and fundamentally changed our relationship that we have with the right to privacy. So let's talk about what things were like before then. Prior to 1970, banks basically could set their own rules for verification when someone opened an account. So it was not uncommon for you to be able to go into your bank account with no ID at all and for them to just create an account for you, and it was all fine. If they trusted you in the community, or if someone vouched for you, or perhaps you explained yourself and said, hey, I'm from out of town, I need this thing. Banks could basically decide for themselves what requirements they needed in order to set up an account. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act was brought in 1970 that basically introduced two main things. The first one was a reporting requirement, and the second one was banks collecting data. So let's backtrack a little bit. What was the climate like around 1970 when the government decided that they didn't like people having foreign bank accounts because maybe people were hiding money offshore? So they basically wanted to get more information about people's bank accounts. But we have the Fourth Amendment. Now, the Fourth Amendment says that the government cannot just collect all of our data without a warrant. And so they can't just dragnet capture everyone's financial details in order to see if someone is lying about money that they have overseas. Is unconstitutional. So what did they do? They mandated that the banks have to collect that information about you. And if someone does a transaction over $10,000, the banks had to file a report. What that comes down to is basically conscripting banks to do this investigatory work and to report on fellow Americans for nothing more than using their own money, essentially. This was a fundamental shift in people's relationship with their banks. We used to have this, confidential agreement, sort of akin to our agreements with our lawyer or our doctor, that we presume there's a private relationship there. And this really turned that on its head. It was kind of that pivotal piece of legislation. And at the time, there was huge outcry. And we're not even going to talk, let's get to how the current situation is. But at the time, that was a huge change. People were saying this is unconstitutional. You cannot just, have mandate that banks collect this information, and you cannot have them report on $10,000 transactions because you don't have a warrant. Get a warrant first. Get probable cause. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately at the time said, no, this doesn't go against the Fourth Amendment. And their reasoning for this was that, well, $10,000 is a life-changing amount of money, $10,000 is not an undue burden because that doesn't go into, that doesn't infringe on people's daily lives. And the real clincher here is that they never wrote into the Bank Secrecy Act anything about inflation. They never said, let's adjust this $10,000 threshold to account for inflation. So let's contextualize this. What does $10,000 buy you in 1970? Like 2 brand new Corvettes plus extra money to pay for taxes and spare parts. In some parts of America, $10,000 would buy you an entirely new house. So yeah, if someone was paying $10,000 for a brand new house, that might be a suspicious enough activity that it warrants probable cause as kind of a dragnet rule. I don't believe that, but I can see how the Supreme Court was like, all right, it's not really infringing in people's daily lives, but $10,000 today infringes on our daily activities, right? So we have 2 phenomena happening in this evolution of financial surveillance, starting with the Bank Secrecy Act that ushered in this kind of new regime. The first one is that surveillance into our lives since then has increased steadily every single day that we have lost purchasing power on the US dollar. So it's increased silently through inflation without the government having to introduce any more laws. It's just crept more and more into our lives. But the second thing is that financial surveillance has explicitly been expanded through all of these additional tack-on laws to this Bank Secrecy Act, which we can dive into as well. So it's kind of been a journey, like that pivotal moment, introduced these tiny things that even at the time were unconstitutional. And from there, it is just grown to astronomical lengths. And we're in a current situation where financial surveillance is pervasive, it's normalized, and it's terrifying.
Folks, we're faced in our day and age with information overload. Some people cope with it by just surrendering and watching cat videos instead. Well, I have a better way to deal with it. With the Blinkist app, you can absorb huge amounts of information in 27 nonfiction categories: technology, religion, history, philosophy, parenting, career, and on and on. Blinkist condenses each book into 15-minute summaries you can read or listen to. That means if you have a half-hour commute each way, you can absorb the equivalent of 4 books on your way and back. Think that might make you a more impressive person? Among the thousands and thousands of titles at Blinkist, you'll also find libertarian classics from Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman, and even a title from old Woods here. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 40% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 40% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. And now for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. It's interesting, isn't it, the way price inflation can change things like this over time, like the $10,000, because $10,000 in 1970, as you say, was rather a bit more money than it is today. But then also it's been responsible for bracket creep, pushing people up into higher and higher tax brackets. They do adjust those from time to time. But there is one way where it maybe worked in our favor. The 7th Amendment says that the right to a jury trial in a federal court in civil cases, you have the right to a jury trial in federal courts if your civil case involves more than $20. Well, it's still $20 today. But of course, $20 is like nothing. $20 is one fast food meal now. So now everything gets a jury trial. So maybe there was one case of it working in our favor.
Yes, we got one win.
Yeah. I'll still take hard money. Doggone it. I'll take come what may.
Come what may.
So bring us then up to, so there have been attempts at passing legislation that have not yet been successful. But I'm not the sort of person to say, oh, well, thank goodness, I guess things are going our way. because it takes only one crisis and then the government's whole wish list gets implemented.
Yeah, so let's keep going through the history because some really interesting things happened with just legislation that keeps on coming. And I do want to circle back to that phenomenon that you kind of hinted at there of this legislation that the attacks keep coming and we have to keep fighting them off. And, they eventually creep through. They eventually slide through and we only ever go in one direction towards more and more surveillance and more power centralization with the federal government. But so the first giant and major increase of the scope of the Bank Secrecy Act happened in 1992 with the Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act. And that had, in my opinion, two big consequences. One of them was they introduced the idea of SARS, which was suspicious activity reports. So it was no longer a $10,000 threshold for reporting things. They introduced this super vague clause about if you kind of maybe suspect that someone might be doing something and it's a little bit suspicious, kind of, in your opinion, and, it could be suspicious in terms of violating any possible law or whatever, write a report about it. So that was one of the things. And what that led to is just a giant, floodgate being opened in terms of the amount of data that the government then starts collecting, because you introduce this kind of liability element. Right? A bank doesn't want to be caught out not filing that one suspicious activity report. So they over-report everything. And I chatted to Nicholas Anthony at Cato, who did a report basically about why a lot of these reports are filed. And he basically said that the number one reason why reports are filed is not suspicious activity. It's because someone, spent money over $10,000. The next reason was someone spent money close to $10,000. So I don't know why they bother having that threshold if it's suspicious to both pass it and suspicious to not pass it, and people are filing reports either way. But basically there's just all of these reports that just get filed, which again amount to nothing more than individuals just using their own money. But banks just start filing them because they don't want to be caught out. They don't want the government turning around and saying, this was suspicious, why didn't you file it? So they just over-report. Now, the second thing that happened with Annunzio Wiley is that it suddenly became confidential that these reports were being filed. So prior to this, when the Bank Secrecy Act came out, because I mentioned that pushback, people saying it's unconstitutional, and one of the your pushback against this were these privacy laws that got enacted, and one of the stipulations in these laws that were to kind of counter the Bank Secrecy Act was, well, all right, if you're going to collect information about people, these people need to at least know about it so that they can challenge it and fight it in court and sue the government or whatever they want to do. We're going to tell the people. Now, with the Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act, they made it illegal for banks to mention when they're filing these reports. So now you can have these suspicious activity reports filed against you, and people have no idea that it's going on. This is one of the insidious things about this surveillance creep that has happened. The scope of surveillance just growing and growing. It's because so much of it deliberately, by design, has been made confidential, that we actually don't know how much data is being collected because banks aren't allowed to tell us. No one is allowed to talk about this. So I just think that is incredibly insidious, and we need to take a step back and start to look at these policies. So that was Annunzio Wiley. Since then, we've had all kinds of new laws being put through. We've had laws, the Treasury recently tried to put through this $600 rule, which said any bank account that has $600 of activity needs to have all of their information go to the government. There was obvious pushback against this. The Treasury's response was, why are you guys concerned? We already collect all this data, which was them saying the quiet part out loud. They ultimately did walk it back a little bit and said, okay, not $600 in any bank account, only if it involves a payment processor or money transmitter. So they're talking about things like PayPal, Venmo, etc. That's hardly a walk back at all. It basically means that if you have $600 worth of transactions going into a PayPal or Venmo account over the course of a year, all of your information is then given to the government. So I don't know how they got that passed, but that was passed. They keep trying in all of these different bills to basically take away the checks and balances that have been put on the Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary of the Treasury basically has this special power where they can sanction transactions and they can stop movement of money across borders and all that. But part of the balance on that is that if they want to use this power, they have to report that they've used it in this registry, which is basically this record of all the things that the executive branch do. And they, I think it's 4 different times in 4 separate bills, they've tried to remove that balance of power. They've tried to say, well, we don't want the Treasury Department to have to report this because if they keep it secret, they could start using this power more. So this hasn't passed yet, but it hasn't gone away. And it goes back to what we were talking about just prior, which is this barrage of legislation after legislation that is stripping away our privacy. And it gets to a point where, eventually one of these things sneaks through, then it becomes law, and you kind of can't get rid of it. So, yeah, we've really only gone in one direction with financial surveillance. And, we can get to the Patriot Act in a second. That was another giant thing that changed the financial landscape.
That one I've heard of compared to the rest of it.
The Patriot Act, it's interesting because whenever anyone talks about the Patriot Act, it's a given now that this was this behemoth surveillance law that should not have been passed. It was passed in a hurry. It was passed after no one bothered to read it because it's giant. No one possibly could read it. And we only really talk about the general surveillance that happened. And we don't really talk about the financial surveillance that happened as a result or push back against that. But it was the Patriot Act that really formalized and codified KYC regulation, which means that the bank doesn't just have to know who you are, they really have to know who you are. They have to collect huge amounts of information about you and really do invasive practices into that. And so that was what the Patriot Act kind of changed, which just, again, ushered in this new regime of normalizing invasive surveillance into the individual's life when they're doing nothing more than using their own money in their own bank account. So, yeah, the Patriot Act is kind of this interesting phenomenon because it's also an example of politicians realizing that they can get what they want by basically taking these must-pass behemoth bills that no one can read, sliding sneaky clauses in there, and they can actually get things passed that way. This was, a great example of them trying to sneak through a bunch of surveillance thing and we're in a moment of crisis. Let's sneak through all these laws in this giant bill no one has the ability to read. But since then, we've had all kinds of behemoth omnibus bills that have snuck in more financial surveillance clauses that people don't notice and then they get passed. Or, it's become this mechanism that politicians are leaning on to sneak through things that they want enacted. And it's a little bit scary.
So why don't I play devil's advocate? Well, where would be the fun if there weren't a little devil's advocate?
True.
Some people may say, all these things are minor inconveniences, that they affect my daily life in no way. If the IRS is going to get me, it's going to get me anyway. So it doesn't really change my life. I have nothing to hide. I'm just a regular guy who works 40 hours a week and deposits his paycheck in the bank. I'm not worried they're going to find anything. So it's no real problem for me. It's not like you guys nitpick and worry about the tiniest thing. This is not a problem for me. So what's why should that person be concerned?
So if we're just focusing on financial surveillance right now, the financial payment rails have been recognized as this way to catch more bad guys. So that's another way that people justify this. We're going to catch more criminals. So what does it matter, this inconvenience to me, if we're catching the bad guys? And it's a really interesting point, right? Because first of all, we have to think, well, the more surveillance we add, the more bad guys we're going to catch, right? That's a good thing. And ultimately, maybe we'll get to a point where we've caught all the bad guys. And won't that be the ideal society? When all of these criminals are caught, we can all live in peace. And actually, we have to take a step back from that because the ideal crime rate in a society is not zero. And that's a counterintuitive thing to say because people are like, obviously, a society with less crime is better than a society with more crime. But actually, you have to look at the costs of getting to that zero crime world. And if we are creating an infrastructure of pervasive surveillance into our most intimate activities where we can no longer do things in private, we can no longer make choices without a government that has a monopoly on the use of force knowing about it. I mean, it doesn't take a wild imagination to see possible bad repercussions of that. Every totalitarian regime in history has controlled their society through surveillance. So if we are literally systematizing surveillance in every area of our lives and making it impossible for someone to escape that surveillance, that is a really scary society. It's not meant to be easy for the government to get all of our information. It's meant to be difficult. It's meant to require them going out and proving probable cause. It's meant to require them going out and getting a warrant and saying what they're looking for. The reason why we have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Fourth Amendment is to create a check on this ultimate power. Government has a lot of power. And the worst thing would be them just accumulating so much power that we hit a tipping point and the individual no longer has a voice. In order to create that balance, we have all of these checks on the power. One of them is, all right, if you're going to use this ultimate power for force and interference in our lives, at least prove that you've got a probable cause. So we don't end up like, it was in England when they were pushing it back against all of this with the writs of assistance, which was this idea that any officer of the law could go into any household, rifle through all of their belongings, find something to get them on, throw them in jail, only because they said something bad about the government. We wanted to create a system that got away from that. So what we have now is a system of checks and balances, which says, listen, some bad guys are going to fall through the cracks. And actually that's okay because the cost on society of creating a system of pervasive surveillance where the government is omnipotent is way too high. That is a situation that is one of the darkest timelines. We don't want to get to there. And what's ended up happening is despite this system of checks and balances, the government seems to have circumvented a lot of these checks and centralized more and more control and created essentially a system of digital surveillance that is getting harder and harder for the individual to extricate themselves from. I think that we're at a scary point where we need to take back and say, is this a society that we want to live in? Or do we want to start to get more oversight in these surveillance systems? Do we want to start to push back? Do we think that the government should have access to every financial transaction that we make? Because in 1970, we thought that just having access to $10,000 worth of transactions, that was unconstitutional. These days, they have access to every swipe of our credit card. All our data is handed over in bulk. And people seem to think this is fine. I think we need to change the conversation as a society and say, is this cost too high? Maybe things are okay right now. Maybe you're okay and trust the current government. Maybe you trust the current system of government where you can vote in your preferred person to control this information. I think that even if you like the current government, you have to understand that regimes come and go, social norms change, but all of this data is forever, and you've created a system, an apparatus of pervasive surveillance where all it takes is a person in power who doesn't like your demographic and all of your freedom is taken away. So we do not want to set up that system that takes away people's right to privacy because privacy is a foundation of a free society.
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Very well said. Now, I remember having my mind blown as a college freshman when in an economics course, the professor said, the optimal amount of pollution is not zero. And at first, because I had never heard this, I had never heard the idea that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I thought, what kind of a misanthrope is this guy? But what he was saying was that the cost of ameliorating some pollution is maybe reasonable. We may want to bear it. But as there is less and less pollution remediation to be done, it's an incredibly rapidly increasing cost to do it, a cost that almost no one would be willing to bear because it would come at the expense of other things that we value so much more highly than removing particles that we can't even perceive. And I realized, well, then I was reading your article, and I thought you made a good point that the optimal amount of crime in the world is actually not zero either. Because we could, as you said, we could burn the whole world down to prevent somebody from stealing a pack of gum. This is not a trade-off anybody wants to make. So it could be that in protecting the privacy and rights of individuals, it could be that a few guilty people go free. But that's okay, because if it's quite possible that if we eliminated all possibility of those people doing anything wrong, we would do so many other wrongs that it wouldn't be worth it. And not to mention, I'll just say in parentheses, I think people who are guilty of alleged financial crimes, most of these are victimless crimes anyway. I don't even care. So I'm not even that worried that, oh no, some bad guys are getting away. Half the time these bad guys aren't really so bad anyway.
And also, could we talk for a second about this crime of money laundering? I have some beef with it. And people talk about well, they were guilty of money laundering. And money laundering, it was this invented crime where basically the government realized if they could put surveillance cameras on every corner of the financial rails, they could catch bad guys. But, what's even easier than that is if we make the movement of money the actual crime instead of the bad things they actually did, then we can catch far more people. And again, the downside, the cost of that is that every innocent person has lost the ability to make a transaction without countless third parties now knowing about it. So this money laundering, this idea of money laundering, the movement of money should not be a crime. It's kind of like saying, someone could kill someone with a knife, right? And so are we going to make the purchase of knives the crime and now start going off everyone, against everyone who purchased a knife? Or are we going to actually target the criminals? What happens in a society where we start targeting the technology or the tools they're using is that we sweep up a whole bunch of innocent people in it. And the government gets away with this by saying, well, we'll say that with money laundering, it really comes down to intent. If you intended to obfuscate funds and they were used in illicit crimes or whatever, it's the intent that counts. Well, now you've just created a giant can of worms where government can arbitrarily enforce one of their laws. And that's, again, not a society you want to live in, where you don't have laws that people have certain expectations about what's good or bad. It's no, it's up to whoever wants to prosecute you to decide that, well, it was your intent to do something. It becomes this arbitrarily enforced thing that becomes weaponized and used against people that they don't like. Money laundering is just, it's one of these things that I have a lot of beef with.
Well, I agree. Every time I hear money laundering, I roll my eyes. But you said something early on that maybe we should return to before we start wrapping things up, because I know how interested. And you're going to think this is crazy, but just the other day, because I'm preparing another cruise, I actually was watching bits and pieces of the Family Feud game we played on board the cruise.
Oh, fun!
And I think the question was, name the first website you view every day. And your answer was CoinMarketCap. And I remember thinking, she's great. She is so passionate about what she does, right? But that question, and I know you're interested in Bitcoin in particular, the question of financial privacy and the question of crypto maybe don't mix all that well, because cash is much more private than Bitcoin. So how do you reconcile those things in your mind?
Yeah, I would not recommend anyone use Bitcoin for privacy. So Bitcoin is one example of many, many different cryptocurrencies. And I think in the early days of Bitcoin, people made the presumption that, well, Bitcoin's pseudonymous, which means that if I'm careful enough with my online privacy and never linking my real world identity with my Bitcoin usage, that's good enough. And what we've learned is the government has incredible surveillance capabilities where that pseudonymous link is tenuous and very easily broken. So in the last, 12 years since Bitcoin's creation, well, I know more than that, 2009. So it's maybe in the last decade, I could say, a lot of these coins have started to be experimented with and developed. So new technology has come along that use things like zero-knowledge proofs, for example, which basically is a complicated and fancy way of saying that we can make digital information private. We can encrypt it. We can scramble it all up so that no one can make any sense of it, and it actually can't be deciphered unless you own, certain tokens to prove ownership. So basically what I'm saying is cryptocurrency is a wide tent. There's incredible technology now that enables you to have very private transactions online. And it currently, for all of crypto's bad points and all of the things people say, let's just grant all of those. Let's say, okay, you're right about all these downsides. At the same time, crypto is the only possible way to make private digital transactions in a modern digital world. So yeah, I can use cash in my day-to-day life, and I do. And I love cash. And I go to the store and they always give me the price and walk away from the register expecting I'm going to tap my card. And I stand there with my coin purse and I'm like, sorry, I'm going to need change with my cash I'm handing over. They're always a little shocked because I'm probably the only person that day that's going to pay in cash. But then if I want to buy something online and have privacy, what are my options? Everything in the traditional financial system is surveilled. Everything that touches my bank account is surveilled. So we have alternative payment rails now. And so I would encourage people, even if they are skeptical of it, to just understand that the value proposition of having a way to make digital payments in a digital global economy is very, very valuable when those payments are private. We don't get that in the traditional financial world. So it's worth exploring this new financial payment rails that are being created by the free market every single day and start exploring the benefits of those, because I think they're going to be essential, especially when we have CBDCs, especially when we have a world where cash is made obsolete. We're already seeing it in Australia with banks basically closing down cash withdrawals and saying we're no longer dealing with cash at all. It's a global phenomenon. Places in Europe have just started having more cash limits. So I think that people honestly need to be looking for alternatives. You can look at gold. Gold is great. If we can repopularize using gold in everyday transactions, I'd love that. I don't think it's going to happen. And we do have something that has a lot of market value and is one of the most liquid assets in the world right now. So I would start exploring some of these new currencies and not be dissuaded because technology is scary. It is. But just dive into it and start learning about it, and you may see that the value proposition is actually really important.
Do you feel like we covered the basics? Have I overlooked anything that you're just dying to add to this? Okay, that's a good sign.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest takeaways I think people should have is that we have normalized pervasive surveillance in our lives. And we, as you said, the knee-jerk reaction of most people is, I have nothing to hide. Why should I care? I'm blasé. And it's bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us. It's bigger than the individual saying, well, I'm not that ashamed of anything. We need to reclaim the conversation. We need to stop talking about it in terms of what have I got to hide. That is a way of constructing this narrative where the people who want privacy are shamed. What are you trying to hide? You know what? I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm trying to protect my information, and it's my right to do so. And I think that as conscientious citizens who believe in fundamental rights, we need to start reclaiming that narrative and asserting those rights, because they're very quickly disappearing. And you may not have anything to hide now, but you don't know which government is going to be in control, which regime is going to be in control tomorrow. You don't know what people are going to be doing with your data tomorrow. We need to start reclaiming the right to privacy and reclaiming the narrative around it and normalizing it. Privacy is normal. I don't have to justify it. I don't have to have something to hide. It's something that I can just assert and say, you know what, it's my right to have privacy. I draw the curtains. I close the bathroom door. I wear clothing. These are all things that I'm allowed to do. I don't have to explain it to anyone. So let's stop demanding answers from people like, what have you got to hide? And let's just start normalizing privacy because it is our right and it is essential to a free society.
And if people want to pursue this and other related topics that you cover, what's the best link to do that?
Yeah, so we put all of our content online. We make tutorials teaching them how to reclaim online privacy. We break it down really simply so that there are easy things you can do that make a huge difference to the amount of your personal data that's collected. You can go, if you go to YouTube, you can type in Naomi Brockwell TV, but we're on all kinds of privacy-preserving platforms. If you watch our content, you'll find out more about them and where you can more privately watch videos. But I would suggest going to nbtv.media and you'll find all of our links there about our tutorials. We have a free newsletter that you can get weekly privacy tips straight to your inbox. But I was just start learning about all of this stuff and diving in.
All right, excellent. Well, I just jotted that down to make sure I put that link both in the description as well as at tomwoods.com/2496. Well, once again, Naomi Brockwell, thanks so much for your time and all the important work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.